Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the very last of these videos of notes from Math Analysis. It's really weird to think that it's been 2 full months that we've been doing this. I'm recording this on Sunday the 10th, and when I look at the calendar, exactly 2 months ago today, I had students putting these pictures on our school website. We were all down in Des Moines that week celebrating the second straight week at state, and it was an awesome time for pretty much everybody. That week ended on Friday the 13th, and that's when pretty much everything changed, not just at Garrigan, but all over the world. I was excited that day to be one of just a handful of fans who was allowed inside Wells Fargo to see the state championship game. Looking back, Iowa's state basketball championships were just about the last sports event to happen anywhere for a long, long time. The NCAA tournament was canceled, the pro sports league suspended their seasons, and even the Olympics was postponed. Many of you are planning to travel to New York in mid-March, and I know you were all upset to have that trip canceled. Right after we decided not to go, pretty much everything in the Big Apple closed down. Even with the shutdown, more than 300,000 New Yorkers got sick, and more than 21,000 of them have died from COVID-19. In the weeks since then, we've all gotten way too familiar with how the graphs of exponential functions, like the spread of a disease, work. Like I said, we've been at this for 2 months now, and amazingly, we really are almost at the end. You guys won't have a final exam in any of your classes this year, but we do sort of have a final quiz in math analysis. What we're going to be doing this week is a quiz that just sort of sums up the stuff that we've learned in Chapter 0 as we've gone through the online work this spring. Now this week I'm not going to go through a lot of formal examples. What I'm mostly going to do is just mention the topics that we've gone through in Chapter 0, just to make sure you remember the main things that we need to know. When you get to your quiz, you're going to see one or maybe two questions about each of those topics. It'll be a little bit longer than most of the quizzes you've had, but not a whole lot longer. There's a worksheet on the website that's called Supplementary Exercises that just gives you a chance to review some more of this. If you know what you're doing, great. If you don't, you might want to practice just a little bit more with those problems. One of the first things we've done this quarter was evaluating functions. And you've done that earlier this year. You also did it in the past. That means if I have something like f of x equals 3x squared minus 5x plus 2, and I give you some numbers to plug in, like f of -4, you should be able to figure out what you've got. Something that some of you guys had a little bit more trouble with was finding the domain of functions. Domain means what numbers are you allowed to plug in for x. And there were two things that could go wrong with the domain. One of them is if you had a fraction, a rational function, you can't have 0 on the bottom. And that meant that if I had something like x over x minus 2, I know I can't ever plug in 2 into that function. So I could have anything from -infinity to 2 and anything from 2 to infinity, but not 2 itself. The other thing that could go wrong is that if you had a square root, what was under the square root always had to be positive. So like if I had the square root of x plus 1, I know x plus 1 has to be greater than or equal to 0, which means x would have to be greater than or equal to -1. A lot of this chapter dealt with solving quadratic equations, and that's because the further you go in math, the more useful that skill ends up being. The main way to solve quadratic equations was usually factoring, and we talked about both the main process of factoring and also some of the things that you could do that would screw that up. You probably will have one or two questions that do involve factoring on your last quiz. And of course, if you couldn't factor, you could always find answers to quadratic equations by using the quadratic formula. Chances are, of all of these topics, that's the one that's the least likely to be on your quiz, but it is one of the main topics we did in this chapter. Another big topic that came up, which also goes back to the beginning of the year as well, was composite functions. When you need to find something like f of g of x. That's another topic that the further you go in advanced math, the more important it becomes, and you probably will have something that involves composite functions as well. For a lot of you guys, the hardest thing that we did this spring was what were called rational functions. If you think back to the quizzes we've had, that was when you had the quizzes that weren't online, you had to kind of do them by hand. And what we're doing is basically adding or subtracting fractions. That was what that was about. There will probably be one question that involves rational functions on this last quiz you've got to do. However, the good news is that it is an online quiz, and that's likely to be a multiple choice answer. Both at the beginning and the end of this whole review section, we've done exponents. And exponents, again, are a very useful skill in what you're doing later. You will have a couple of questions on your quiz that do deal with how to simplify exponents. And the last of the topics that we're going to do was actually the first topic that we learned in Chapter 0. It's the idea of interval notation, which was where you use parentheses and brackets to describe regions on the number line, or technically we'd call them subsets of the real numbers. This is the one thing that I am going to do a couple of review examples of here because it's not on the worksheet. And I'm actually going to look at 5 intervals. I've got a couple of them here, and I want you to think for just a second. If I said what interval is graphed for each of these, think through it and see if you can figure out what you would write down in interval notation for what's graphed for each of these regions. And the important thing there is that you use parentheses to show that you don't include an endpoint, and you use square brackets to show that you do. So the first one, we would have an open interval from -2 to 3. The second one is a closed interval from 1 to 2. The first one's got parentheses, the second one's got brackets. So what would you do with this example? Here we've got one side that's open and one side that's closed, and that's why I've got parentheses, -4, comma, 0, bracket. And here's the last 2 examples I'm going to look at quick. See if you can remember how would you write these in interval notation. Well, this time what we're looking at is x is greater than 2 and x is less than or equal to 0. But in interval notation, the way you show that is with infinities. So I have the interval from 2 to infinity. I have parentheses at the beginning because it's a circle there. And anytime I use either positive or negative infinity, that always goes with parentheses as well. So 2 comma infinity and parentheses at the end. Second one is negative infinity to 0. I put a bracket by the 0 because we do include that, but again, anything with infinity is just parentheses. So again, there's one last quiz that you guys will be doing this week. If there are any of those topics you're not totally confident on, you could go back and look at some of the older videos that I have, or what might actually be the most useful is to look at the answers to some of the questions about those topics and just review quick, make sure you know what's going on before you take that quiz. Like I said, this one's going to be a little bit longer than the others, but it still is just a quiz, and you should be able to do it pretty quickly. And that really is the end. It wraps up everything we're going to be doing here in math analysis. You got one quiz, and then you are out of here for the year. It's been kind of a strange semester, but hopefully you guys have gotten some productive stuff out of it. Hope to see a lot of you guys again in the fall. And until then, have a good summer, and let's hope things are back to normal when we get back in August.